Welcome to The Waterfall,
a video podcast and community in which we explore well-being, sustainability, the arts and technology, as well as sharing our experience of slow travel around Europe.
In this episode, Kaberi and I hear from Mohua Mukherjee, a distinguished economist with over 30 years of global experience in development economics, sustainability, and renewable energy.
As India Energy head at the World Bank, she led a $1 billion solar energy program and played a key role in advancing renewable energy policy and infrastructure.
Beyond her World Bank tenure, Mohua served as program ambassador for the International Solar Alliance, promoting solar energy adoption worldwide.
She is also an independent director on the board of a microfinance bank, contributing her expertise in structured finance and sustainability.
We caught up with her in Kolkata, India.
We began by asking her whether it is really true that more economic growth will make people's life better.
I don't think so at all. I think that particularly GDP, which is whose growth is measured, actually doesn't count. I mean, it's a very blunt instrument. It doesn't count the growth of all the bad things, such as pollution or, and more importantly, it doesn't do a good job with the service industries. And most countries are now developing in the service direction, particularly since there's so much technology change. I think Simon Kuznets came up with it after the Great Depression and on the eve of World War II, that he was just looking for a quick fix. And somebody had talked about it as squashing a frog into a matchbox. He was sort of taking all the good, the bad, and the ugly and everything and agglomerating it. And it was never intended to be permanent, but somehow people got the idea that it referred to the size of the overall pie. And if there was GDP growth, then it would mean more pie for them. It's very easy to measure because it's a single number, but it actually does not represent well-being at all. It says nothing about equality. It sort of can mask terrible inequality as well as environmental and ecological destruction. We definitely need a better measure, not GDP, but the trick is really how to raise public awareness so that people demand of their politicians accountability for delivering better well-being, be that through improved health, improved education, improved air and water, and and then I also believe there's a huge difference in this for developing countries that are still trying to meet the SDGs versus developed countries, which also have inequality problems, but they're at a different stage. But everybody needs to kind of leave behind GDP growth as the sole measure.
The Club of Rome, which originally came up with the Limits of Growth report, which raised everybody's awareness to the idea that there was a climate crisis happening. In 1972, then of course, for the last 50 years, what we've seen is that people trying to argue that no, there's no such thing as a climate crisis. Climate scientists don't agree, and there's disagreement. So now that was talking about the business as usual scenario was one of the four scenarios that they looked at. And looking back, now the Club of Rome has published Earth for All, which is a kind of follow-up report to Limits of Growth, and their subtitle is A Survival Guide for Humanity. They have essentially two scenarios that they're looking at. One is too little, too late, which is basically a continuation of business as usual.
Yes.
And one of the basic things that they say will be needed to make what they call as their alternative scenario, which is the giant leap, is to have a different measure of society, which is namely well-being.
Yes.
And they have identified two things. One is the Average Wellbeing Index, which takes into account dignity, so worker disposable income after tax, nature, climate change, global surface average temperature in Celsius, so it is part of that measure. Connection, so government services indicated by spending per person, i.e. to institutions that serve common good. Fairness, the ratio of owner income after tax to worker income after tax, and participation, people's observed progress, previously improving well-being,
Yeah.
and labour participation. And there's another measure which they call the social tension index. And the reason why they're doing that is to say that as people become more and more concerned by inequality, and maybe that's the source of the public pressure that you were thinking about, as to where is this going to come from. And this was also predicted in the book Donut Economics. Its author, Kate Raworth, has basically said that growth curve doesn't carry on keeping on in a sort of straight or upwardly moving line forever. And what she's suggesting is that as you reach the limits of the resources, then it starts to plateau.
Exactly. Yeah. You can't produce anymore, even if there's demand for it. There's no resources.
And what she's suggested, her book was from 2017, what she was suggesting is that the closer you get to this limit of the resources, the more public disturbances and protests and things you'll start to see.
If we juxtapose that with the climate crisis, then it becomes even more pressing, sort of in the sense that I think Europe had quite a few tastes of what developing countries go through all the time. And of course, in the US and Australia, I'm talking about the OECD countries that are now feeling the brunt. The populations are feeling the brunt. It's no longer something that is, happening in far off countries with hot climates and people with strange customs. It's now kind of come home to the OECD countries. And so I think particularly young people are getting more aware of the need for their politicians to be accountable to deliver climate action. Well-being cannot be divorced from climate action, I believe now.
Yeah.
People need, the watchword that I have in mind is really resilience of all kinds. There's economic resilience, just ability to adjust to shocks. For example, we just had the pandemic. I don't think any country came out smelling like roses from that. And then there's, of course, climate resilience. How do you adapt all your infrastructure so that you don't see your bridges washed away or your sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants flooded out? Because usually they're built in a floodplain, so they're going to be the first to flood. So when these once in 100-year or once in 1,000-year events start happening every 15 years, I think today's young people need to elect politicians who will pay attention to that and protect them, in a sense, and give them that resilience. When you mentioned things like dignity and choice and other things that are part of the Wellbeing Index, I think that's wonderful. That's very much a sort of Western-centric idea, because of course all people need dignity, but there are people who need to survive first in order to have that dignity and enjoy the dignity. So there are much more basic imperatives for probably more than half the Earth's population who are living in developing countries and still struggling to meet the SDGs and struggling to achieve any kind of energy transition or meet any climate goals because the financing isn't there. So India is one of the rare developing countries that is actually making progress on climate action and trajectory, because India is large enough, it's able to mobilize some funding. I think it's able to mobilize some $44 billion a year. Of course, it needs $1 trillion, so 44 billion is a drop in the ocean, but still, it's able to have a solar program, a onshore wind program, and it's doing a bit of adaptation. I believe at COP27, a new thing called the Mangrove Alliance was formed. Countries with coastlines with mangroves will now pledge to protect them. One of the things I see India doing is definitely realizing that part of one of the very useful tools in the toolbox is nature-based solution and all kinds of nature-based solutions using natural assets as a carbon sink for example. So India is doing that probably more than other countries. I think that the Club of Rome and Kate Raworth are most definitely onto, something which is to just beat the drums about saying stop talking about GDP, and alone, because GDP is not doing us, it's doing us a disservice actually, because it's sweeping so many things under the rug. We need a much more multifaceted kind of way in which a scorecard for ourselves. But again, the same way as you were explaining, for the past 50 years, people have just found incrementalism to be the most convenient. And the fact that you can make promises about 2070 and so on when net zero promises, when you're nowhere, you're 6 feet under by then, so it's someone else's problem. The way our politics are financed in most countries, the fossil fuel industry has a very sort of, oversized role. And the fossil fuel industry in all countries continues to get huge subsidies from the government, everywhere, including in India, but especially so in the US and in Europe. They are also the ones financing the politicians. So the politicians are not going to essentially bite the hand that feeds them. But India is carrying on with the message that we should stop subsidizing all fossil fuels, not just make coal the bad guy alone. And of course, then talking about coal, another element of well-being is the just transition and what to do about shutting down coal fields, coal plants, these huge coal-based economies that are very much prevalent in India, but in much of the developing world. You can't be promoting well-being through sustainability on one hand, while forgetting about what's going to happen to those who will lose their coal-related livelihoods. All the countries that have good R&D programs, most developing countries don't. So we are talking about essentially the US, Europe, Japan, possibly China, that are doing R&D on new technologies. They are looking for technological dominance and superiority with climate technologies, mind you. So they're looking at these as purely commercial ventures, and they want to capture a very high rate of return, despite the fact that much of the funding was originally public funding that the corporations didn't have to pay for. They got grants to pursue these new technologies. They're not going to share them. The question is that developing countries are already highly indebted. They are not in a position to borrow heavily to afford these climate technologies. One of the things that India has done very well among developing countries is what they're calling public digital infrastructure. So this UPI, the Universal Payments Interface in India, which has drastically transformed the access of everybody with a mobile phone to being able to make online payments and receive money online. India has declared itself willing to share this with anybody. And I think that it will contribute to setting up some building blocks for us all to be talking about well-being and move away gradually from GDP.
You can find out more about the economic case for focusing on well-being rather than growth in the book Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist by Kate Raworth.
And you can read more about the environmental case in the Club of Rome report, Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity.
In the next episode of The Waterfall, we will be hearing from Ayurveda doctors Dr. C.M. Pradumna and Dr. Mrs. Pradumna.
Until then, Obhi and I look forward to reading your reflections about this episode in the Waterfall community.